The most dramatic change has been the Trump invasion or attack on Iran, and that has thrown a completely new twist into the global economy.
Many people say Sanae no mix is just still giving money by issuing JGBs. That's wrong. Sanae no mix is investment. So that's my ideas. So I think this policy mix could push up Japan's economy, further. So that is the idea of the Sanae no mix, investment and the easy monetary policy together.
The problem is that in the past, when we've tried to fight this from a more realistic economic perspective, we've been typecasted left-wing versus right-wing. Okay? To me, this is not left versus right, it's right versus wrong. I would love to work with you to do that, to convince the Japanese government and Japanese public in general that they should not be afraid of government debt.
皆様、こんにちは。ニュースの争点編集部の清水です。本日は特別企画といたしまして、豪華なお二人による対談をお届けいたします。お一人目は、クレディアグリコル証券チーフエコノミストであり、高市政権の日本成長戦略会議のメンバーも務めていらっしゃいます、会田卓司先生です。そしてもう一方、こちらは2008年の金融危機をいち早く発見し、主流派経済学に対する鋭い批判で世界的に知られている経済学者、スティーブン・キーン先生です。本日は財政赤字や政府債務をめぐる日本ではあまり語られてこなかった視点も含めてお二人にたっぷりと語っていただいております。それではお二人の対談をご覧ください。
Well, obviously, since we last decided to hold this discussion, the most dramatic change has been the Trump invasion or attack on Iran, and that has thrown a completely new twist into the global economy. The main problems being the elimination of a large part of the supply of both, not just energy, but also fertilizer, helium, sulfuric acid, and several other vital chemical components of modern civilization that we're going to lose at least 20% of, if not more. So given the damage that war is doing and the fact that it seems interminable, as most American wars end up being, we are likely to see at least a 10% fall, if not more, in energy available for the global economy. And given the extremely tight link between energy and output, we are likely to see a recession of the scale of about a 10% fall in global production. That is only the surface level, because below that we have the impact of losing fertilizer, something like 30% of global fertilizer supplies, and the damage that losing sulfuric acid will do to so many industrial processes, plus equally the damage helium will do to high-tech manufacturing processes. So I think a recession, a global recession, combined with widespread famine, is a likely outcome for this year. It was completely shocking, completely unnecessary, but that's the additional effect that has come out of this year's craziness with the American administration. Below that, I was not expecting a serious financial crisis this year, because largely credit, which I see as driving the economic cycle, has been suppressed ever since the global financial crisis, for most countries around the world, and for Japan, really ever since the bubble economy burst back in 1990. There was not a large amount of credit-based demand. There was not likely to be a large amount of growth coming out of that at the same time, but there was not likely to be a serious crash like the 2008 downturn. That has all been thrown into the chaos by the Trump administration, because we are now likely to see the financial impact of a breakdown in production systems globally. Once companies can no longer produce, they can equally no longer service the debt they have. And this, to me, implies we are likely to see a financial crisis this year, as well as the physical crisis, because so many companies, so many households will be unable to service their financial commitments because of the collapse in the physical economy. And I think that will cause a serious recession this year as well. And but I'll leave those for opening comments, and let's have a discussion from this point.
Hi, Professor King. I'm Dr. Aidan, Chief Economist at Credit Agricole. So thank you very much for your very insightful view on global economy. So I'd like to ask you one question on Japan's economy. So in this time of global turmoil, so how do you view Japan's structural strengths and the potential?
I have regarded Japan as being trapped in the aftermath to a debt deflation ever since 1990. And this is the main issue Japan has had for 30 years, that the aftermath of the bubble economy period in 1970 to 1990 fundamentally, left Japan with a huge overhang of private debt, which particularly affected the Japanese corporations, because I'm not an expert on Japan, so please forgive me if I make some mistakes in talking about the political structure. But the keiretsu system that gave you industrial conglomerates amongst Japanese corporations meant that in many ways Japanese banks played a similar role to equity in the American corporate system. So the Japanese corporations naturally had a high level of private debt commitments to American corporations, but that debt was something which was absorbed within the overall corporate structure of the keiretsu system. So it means Japan has a higher level of private debt than corporate debt than most of the rest of the world, but it was a limitation, but it was not going to cause bankruptcy, okay? Because the keiretsu system meant the bank regarded itself as having positive relations with its companies in the same group. But what it means is corporations are now carrying a substantial level of private debt. In my records coming from the Bank of International Settlements, business debt in Japan peaked at 145% back in 1993, fell substantially to 100%, but is now running at about 120% of GDP. And fundamentally what this means is that money which would have been invested into industrial development in the 1980s and 1990s is largely going to service that debt. And so you don't have a high savings rate so much as having a high debt service commitment, which means that investment is not being undertaken. So my main issue for Japan for some time has been you have to find a way to reduce the level of private debt, both business debt and household debt, to enable the economy to grow with the vitality it had back in the 1970s and 1980s. Now that has been made much more serious by the disaster in Iran, because your dependence upon imported oil and imported resources in general is going to make you very exposed to a shutdown of the physical resources coming out of the Strait of Hormuz. So I think it's now imperative in many ways to reduce that private debt burden, even more so than it was beforehand. And a proposal which I put forward decades ago now, which no country has ever tried, I think it's now time for Japan to try that policy. And that would be the idea of a modern debt jubilee. Use the government's capacity to create money to enable the private sector to cancel private debt. And I think one thing you and I are very much of the same mind on is that the fiscal debt is not an issue, particularly because Japan has been normally running trade surpluses. Japan's debt is owed to Japanese institutions and people. The government debt is not a problem. It can be serviced. It can even be handled, be expanded as a part of the process of reducing the level of private debt. So I think the focus upon fiscal consolidation, all the standard economic policy which Japan has been following until this administration, is counterproductive. And there's now a chance for this administration to say, we don't need to worry about the level of government debt. We do need to worry about the level of private debt. And therefore, what I would be seeing as a major policy focus for this year for Japan would be to drastically reduce the level of private debt and then enable the private sector not to go bankrupt as a consequence of the impact of the collapse of the flow of goods and services through the Strait of Hormuz.
Thank you very much for your extremely insightful view on the global and Japanese, overview. And the Japan position, potential, and direction. Now, let me change the subject slightly. For the past 20 years, So I have been analyzing Japanese economy using my own framework. So I feel that I have arrived at a similar conclusion to yours.
Yeah.
So next, I would like to give a more comprehensive explanation of the structural problems of the Japanese economy and the solution that I consider most important at present, Sanae Economics. So first, let me discuss structural problems of the Japanese economy. So let's go to page 5. Is the most important economic indicator corporate savings rate. So in normal economy, of course, corporate saving rate should be negative because they borrow to invest. But Japan's long-term problem, structural problem is positive corporate saving rate. So corporate investment was very, very weak and they are saving, paying back debt. So they are destroying aggregate demand. Then government deficit already there to increase spending to offset this shortage of investment. So black line is the government deficit. It's already there. Then we add both saving rate together, corporate saving rate plus government deficit. So blue plus black is gray. Gray is the net domestic funding demand. So normally, net domestic fund demand should be negative. So they borrow and spend. So money expands, nominal GDP expands, and the money can flow from corporate government sector to household sector. That's a normal economy. But you can see Japan's net domestic fund demand had been exactly zero up until COVID. So that's why there was no spending power of corporate government together. Nominal GDP was not growing, and money was not growing, and the CPI was falling, and also money was not able to go into household as income. So that's Japan's stagnation, structural problems, zero net domestic fund demand, zero spending power of government, corporate together. But after COVID, government spent. So you can see net domestic fund demand expanded toward -5. That's why Japan's economy started reflating. So Japan's nominal GDP was already 525 trillion yen, no change in 20 years. But now Japan's nominal GDP expanded to 670 trillion yen. But now tax revenue increased a lot, and corporate still cautious for investment. Net domestic fund demand again zero. So this is Japan's problem. So Sanae Economics want to change it. Sanae Economics want corporate to spend more for investment, and also government will start investing more together. So the investment together with government and the corporate will push down this corporate saving rate and government deficit. Then, we will get another negative net domestic fund demand to reflate Japan's economy. So that is the kind of the theoretical background of Sanae Economics. And investment is very important, right on the side. So this shows that Japan's the capex cycle. So blue line, again, corporate saving rate, right on the side. So negative is good and positive is abnormal. But you can see high correlation with capex cycle. So capex percent of GDP. So Japan's capex cycle was always below 18%, so stagnant. So that means the expected growth rate and expected profitability of corporation have been very, very weak. So that's why Japan equity market was very, very weak and stagnating. But recently, nominal GDP is growing. So corporates started to invest. So now this black line capex cycle finally has broke through 18% ceiling for the first time in 40 years. This is a pivot we are having right now. So expected growth rate, expected profitability of corporation have been rising. That's why Japan's equity market has been very good. And today, Nikkei 225 is above 60,000. So Sanae Economics want to push this corporate capex cycle further toward 19%. then, corporate saving rate, including wages, will catch up. Then corporate saving rate could go back to negative number. Then we can get rid of this structural stagnating pressure. So congratulations to Prime Minister Takaichi. We can reach to a goal of end of stagnation. And you kindly mentioned the debt problem of Japan's economy. So let's go to page talk of debt. So I have been talking about the flow saving. Yeah. You can see Japan gross government liability, gross debt, 213% of GDP, huge. So everybody is looking at only this number, 213% of debt. But as they know, Japan's government has huge financial assets, around 138%, including foreign reserves, extra pension funds, and lending to private sectors and so on. So net debt is only 75. It is smaller than US. And this net debt number, left-hand side in a blue line, it had been rising from 50 to 125. So Japan's, fiscal debt situation had worsened. And the black line is the S&P JGB rating, downgraded from AAA to single A plus. But recently, economy is growing and the financial asset value is increasing. So now net debt as of Q4 2025 is just 67%. So almost equivalent to 3-notch upgrade. So Japan's fiscal situation is improving a lot. But we cannot stop here. We have to look at the corporate sector. So corporate, this corporate net debt, minus 10. We don't have any corporate net debt any longer because they have been paying back debt for 30 years with portable corporate saving rate. Finally, they reached destination, zero net debt. But the country, of course, corporate sector should have net debt. Then debt structure of Japan's economy is A plus B. So net debt of government and net debt corporate. So right hand side, economic debt structure, A plus B. So Japan's debt structure is only 65. US 300, Euro is 100. So Japan debt structure is very, very resilient and strong. That's why Japan's yield level is very, very low level. But this is a flip side of the coin. Very small net debt means our investment has been very, very weak. That's why Japan is stagnating. That's why Prime Minister Takaichi want to increase domestic investment, not just by corporate, but with the government and the corporate together, increase investment, especially for national and economic securities and anti-disaster measures and growth industries. So up until this year, government always had a fiscal goal, primary surplus goal.
Which is a big mistake.
Big mistake because the primary surplus goal means that we cannot invest. We can invest only within cash flow. That's nonsense. That's why Takaichi-san, Prime Minister Takaichi, will change this fiscal goal by middle of this year to make government invest more together with the corporate sectors. So many people say Sanaenomics is just giving money by issuing JGBs. That's wrong. Sanaenomics is investment. So that's my ideas. So I'd like to hear your opinion on this Sanaenomics idea.
Yeah, I completely agree. We work from different foundations, but reach exactly the same conclusion, that the conventional obsession with government debt is a mistake, and the conventional lack of attention to private debt is the other side of that same coin of mistaking the wrong, focusing upon the wrong level of debt as an indicator of the health of an economy. So the fact that government debt is attempted to reduce it. What it actually does, from my perspective, is the government trying to spend equal to or less than it gets in taxation actually ends up destroying fiat-backed money. And this is completely wrong. We need a mixed economy where both the private sector and the government create money. The private sector creates money by lending out more than it gets back in repayments. And of course, because Japan has been going in the opposite direction, then you've had the destruction of private money coming out of the financial operations of the private sector ever since 1990. But the government creates money by spending more than it takes back in taxation. And this does not run up debt. It is effectively that is the essential step to create fiat-backed money. And if what the government should have done is increase fiat-backed money creation, run larger deficits, not trying to reduce them. And that would have gotten Japan out of its problem more rapidly than what is actually done. But what has happened instead is inevitably there has been government deficits being run, not as large as they should be to compensate for what the private sector is doing, but still happening. We need now to just look at the last 30 or 40 years of following conventional economic advice and see it as being damaging and dangerous to follow. And we now need to change to focus upon how the realistic models of how money is created, both by the private sector and by the government sector. Realize Japan and the rest of the world made a mistake of letting private money creation, credit money creation become too excessive, most of it going into asset price speculation rather than to actual productive investment. So, of course, Japan had that experience dramatically between 1980 and 1990. We now need to say that the private money creation should go towards investment. It should not go towards asset price speculation. And the government should be creating money to enable ordinary transactions to take place between private individuals using fiat-backed money, which for the recipients of government spending is a net increase in their net financial worth. When the government spends more than it takes back in taxation, it creates money for the private sector, and that increases the net financial worth of the private sector. And that's what we should be harnessing to get out of this slump. So I would, different perspective to the way that you analyze it, but the same basic conclusion. We need to reduce private debt, get the private sector investing much more, particularly in the case of Japan. That means the corporate sector has to borrow, so it must be taking on additional debt. But to make that feasible, the government must be balancing that by creating fiat-backed money, because that will enable the cash flow from that fiat side will compensate to some extent for the negative effects of increased levels of corporate indebtedness, because, of course, the corporate sector has to finance that indebtedness as well. And so if the government is destroying money, which is what it does by running a surplus, it makes it harder for the corporate sector to service its current financial situation. And that is what is, I think, a major factor in Japan's low rates of growth for the last 30 years. So, yes, the government, we have to get a government that realizes it should, as a responsible government, creates fiat money by spending more than it takes back in taxation, throw away the obsessions of mainstream economics and the ratings agencies with eliminating government debt, realize that government debt is a record of government money creation. Government's debt is the private sector's assets. Break away from that obsession and now label the corporate sector to reduce its level of debt and therefore to start borrowing once more for investment.
Yeah, I totally agree. The money creation is very important, and we made a huge mistake in 2013-14 Abenomics. Bank of Japan made a huge QQE, the quantitative easing in 2013.
Yeah.
At that time, net domestic fund demand was zero. There was no, money creation power of corporate government together. That's why money was accumulating only in the Bank of Japan current account of banks. There is no money flow to private company. That's why Kuroda Bazooka, so Kuroda Big Easing, BOJ, was not working. But after COVID, government expanded and nominal and the net domestic fund demand recovered. So spending power was there. That's why, monetary policy and the fiscal policy mix worked. And finally, Japan's nominal GDP expanded to 670 trillion yen. So there was no such kind of, theoretical and empirical background of money creation of BOJ and the government. That is a very big mistake. So Takaichi-san want to invest more from corporate government together to get net domestic fund demand. And Prime Minister Takaichi put the BOJ dual mandate for the first time in BOJ law. Dual mandate means strong growth and price stability. So up until Ishiba government, government only put the BOJ price stability. That's why they prematurely tightened monetary policy. But Takaichi-san want to invest. So Takaichi-san put the BOJ dual mandate. And, aggressive fiscal policy, including the investment. So I think this policy mix could push up Japan's economy, further. So that is the idea of the Sanae mix. Investment and the easy monetary policy together, and the money creation will expand Japan's economy, further nominal GDP expansion. Then finally, corporate attitude will change. So up until COVID, nominal GDP was always 525 trillion yen. So rationally, corporate sector was not able to expand, investment because business pie was not expanding. But Takaichi-san saying government will make big commit to expand business pie, nominal GDP. Then I think the corporate competition will change from just cost cutting to investment rationally. So that is the kind of the strategy of Sanae mix.
Yeah, and we're very, very compatible on that strategy. I think one thing which we are both conscious of, and it's obvious that mainstream economists and mainstream economic advisors are not conscious of this, is that you use financial assets to create non-financial assets. And the non-financial assets are the physical things we actually enjoy, the physical factories that produce goods, the goods themselves. These are the things we're trying to use the monetary system to create. Now, the monetary system involves financial assets, and a financial asset is your claim on somebody else. A financial liability is somebody else's claim on you. Now, if you look at that in total and analyze government spending out of that, then government spending actually creates financial assets for the non-government sector, which then enables commerce to happen at an accelerated rate. Whereas the obsession with neoclassical economists and the advisors that they believe neoclassical economics is to reduce the creation of financial liabilities for the government. But the government actually, one way that a government shows its where its authority reigns is by creating liabilities on itself that people in that country use as money. So by obsessing with a false model of money, which is what neoclassical economists have, by obsessing about government debt as if governments are in the same situation as households or firms, where if they get into negative financial equity, they must go bankrupt. The government must be in negative financial equity. So we need to invert that whole perspective. And I appreciate the analysis you're doing on this front. What I'm trying to do is to find a way of communicating this to people who don't have the understanding you and I have. And that's where my Ravel software comes in. And what I do with it, I show, if you look at it, if you take a double entry bookkeeping view of financial transactions, it becomes obvious that the government creates money by going into negative financial equity for itself, which creates positive financial equity for the non-government sector. And the analogy I use, which I think you might find useful, is that people have a mental framework that says the government should always be balanced. Okay? But if the government's financial situation is like a seesaw. If the government is in positive equity, then the non-government sector is in identical negative financial equity. So if you want the private sector to be in positive financial equity and therefore feel empowered to spend and invest, you need the government to be in negative, which pushes the private sector into positive. And then with positive financial equity, the private sector is more likely to invest. The cash flow from private individuals will finance corporations that enables them to invest as well. So we have to completely change that understanding. I'm so sorry that I can't show you my Ravel software right now. But what I might try, we give it a try. If it doesn't work, I stop. There we go. That's it. Okay. Right. Now, again, I apologize for how amateur this is going to appear, but this is me using my Ravel software to show financial transactions between households, banks, the central bank, and the government. And the point I'm starting from and trying to explain this to people is that everybody understands that if the government taxes them, their financial net worth falls. So the government taxes by taking money out of deposit accounts. That means that people's deposit accounts fall. There's no compensating increase in any other asset. So the net worth of households and firms falls because of taxation. Okay, so you can see that's showing from the household's point of view, taxation reduces deposit accounts and reduces the net equity of households. It makes it less likely for them to spend. At the bank level, when the deposits fall, the balancing item there is that reserves also fall by the same amount. The next stage is that why do the reserves fall? It's because that's how tax is converted to the government's account at the central bank. So the falling reserves means an increasing amount of money in the consolidated revenue fund, which is the government's account of the central bank. That then means that for the government, taxation increases its financial net worth. Now that's something which I think I could explain that to anybody. They would accept it because that's what they experience. But what they don't mentally connect with is that that means the opposite applies when you look at government spending. Because now if I work in the opposite direction here, and I start from saying what happens with government spending, then government spending goes into private deposit accounts, and that increases the net worth of the households and firms. That then, when that spending, how does the spending arrive? It comes in through reserve accounts at the central bank. Those accounts go up, and they go up because the banks are then required to make payments to the various millions of individuals and firms who have accounts at the private banks, and the reserves going up is what enables those deposits to rise. You come to the central bank, and where do the funds come from? The spending reduces the government's account, and therefore it increases the reserve accounts of the private banks. So government spending reduces the net worth of the government. And that now means that the government spending, which reduces the net worth of the government, increases the net worth of households. So rather than government spending reducing the amount of money the private sector has, which is what economic textbooks teach students and unfortunately eventually politicians, government spending increases the net worth of the household sector and the firms. In fact, it increases the amount of money in the economy. I can put this together again, the final one I'll show, and then I'll go back to talking face to face, is that when you then take a look at, just summarize it and say the gap between government spending and taxation, we call the deficit. So the deficit increases the net worth of the household sector and the firm sector. This is the opposite of what economic textbooks teach. That, again, passes through bank accounts. This deficit causes reserves to rise and deposits to rise. That occurs because the government goes negative on its consolidated revenue fund to enable a transfer to reserves. So the deficit involves the government going to negative financial equity, which creates positive financial equity for the non-government sector. So that's the understanding we need to get into the government sector's mental framework. And I think we can do that with the combination of your work and my work to point out how the actual role of government spending vis-a-vis the private sector.
Thank you. That is very helpful. And almost same thing, we can say with investment in the saving balance. So again, page 39,
just give me a moment again.
I showed only 75% of net debt of the government and corporate net debt minus 10, and the corporate equity 145, and household asset is 293, and we have overseas asset 81. And if we add all of these, should be zero. But Japanese government and Ministry of Finance try to reduce this net debt of the government to zero.
Which makes the problem worse.
Worse. If we reduce this 75 to zero of the government net debt, we know household assets will shrink.
Yes.
25%. That makes it worse. But in Japan, budget is very, very strange. You can see this is very strange Japan, government budget. Page 72, left-hand side.
72,
this is Japan government budget. We have 122 trillion yen budget.
Yeah.
Annual budget. And you can see national debt service, 26%. The payment for debt is already 26% of expenditure. And this national debt services consists of interest rate cost and debt redemption cost. They are trying to reduce debt. That is strange. In right-hand side, the U.S., national debt services only has net interest rate payment, no debt redemption cost. But in Japan, the fiscal way, we use debt redemption costs. But actually, we are just roll over debt. They do not reduce, debt. But, Ministry of Finance is explaining to the public, we have to pay back debt. Debt should be zero in the future. We have to pay back debt by tax revenue of the future generations. So that is the kind of austerity mind of Japanese people and the Japanese government. So that's why they killed net domestic fund demand.
That's true. It is not unique to Japan. This is a fallacy that is taught by mainstream economists and believed all around the world. And the problem is that in the past, when we've tried to fight this from a more realistic economic perspective, we've been typecast as left-wing versus right-wing. Okay? To me, this is not left versus right, it's right versus wrong. And with the way that conventional economists teach people to think about money is as if money is something like a commodity. And if the government spends more than it takes back in taxation, it takes some of that commodity away from the private sector and reduces the capacity of the private sector to spend, which they call crowding out. And they do all that using supply and demand curves, as you'd be aware. That's the way they explain it. When you do the accounting, you get the exact opposite conclusion. The government running a deficit creates a surplus for the private sector, which gives it more capacity to spend. Of course, you want to spend that deficit on sensible things. You don't want to spend it on bombing other countries, which is what America spends its deficit on. You want to spend it on building up your own infrastructure. But that infrastructure construction itself then enables the private sector to be more efficient because you have better communication systems and transportation systems linking private businesses, enabling them to grow. So what we need to get through to people, and this is where my Ravel software, I think, plays a critical role, it shows the accounting. And there's nothing left-wing or right-wing about accounting. It's simply saying this is what the financial system is. And when you look at it that way, the government, in fact, does not create money by going into debt. It creates money by going into overdraft at the central bank, which it owns. And then the problem which so many people have when they try to understand this is they think by analogy. And they think, well, if I was a household and I went into debt to the bank, then I would, if I was to have an overdraft with the bank, first of all, the bank might not allow me the overdraft. Secondly, they will charge me a penalty rate of interest. Third, if I don't manage to turn around, I will go bankrupt and the bank will seize my assets. That's the mentality that most people approach this with. But of course, in the real world, the central bank is owned by government, owned by the Treasury fundamentally. So the central bank cannot refuse the Treasury an overdraft. And that overdraft does not come with any interest payment components to it. And the central bank will not declare the Treasury bankrupt because the Treasury owns the central bank. So it's this mental framework of it, thinking by analogy and thinking in terms of supply and demand diagrams that leads to all these mistaken pieces of logic. So with my Ravel software, I can easily indicate, and I'll just rapidly show this again if I can try to show that screen of mine once more. Again, when the government also has bond auctions, because if you look at what the impact is of the government running a deficit without selling bonds, then the deficit necessarily drives the Treasury's account of the central bank into overdraft, and it creates an identical amount of positive reserves for the banking sector. But if the government then does an auctions bonds, then those auctions, if the auctions are equal to the deficit, then there is no, the consolidated revenue fund doesn't go into overdraft. And that's the actual role of selling the bonds, simply to mean that this account remains positive. It's not the creation of money. It means what bond auctions do is let the government create money without going to overdraft at the central bank. That's really the overall impact of that operation. And so we need to get people to learn the actual accounting. I'm trying to shut down we need people to learn the actual accounting to understand what the real situation should be. I would love to work with you to do that, to convince the Japanese government and Japanese public in general that they should not be afraid of government debt. And in fact, the fact that Japan, as you know, has survived as an economy functionally ever since the bubble economy crashed in 1990, running up a huge government debt, but it has not had negative consequences. It is a myth. And one of the reasons that Japan is safe on this front is because you're running a trade surplus. Now, the one thing I do worry about is what's going to be the impact on Japan's trade surplus of the craziness in the Gulf, in the Middle East, because that could mean you go into deficit on the trade balance. And once you're in trade deficit, then you are potentially in problems. So we need to re-educate people to realize that the deficit that matters is not the government deficit, it's the trade deficit. And because Japan has had a trade surplus for so long, if it maintains that trade surplus, then it's insulated from those negative effects.
Okay, thank you very much. And I totally agree to the power of money creation. And the degree of power of money creation is the net domestic fund demand. So Japan's net domestic fund demand was over zero. So no power of money creation. But the US, page 81, left-hand side, 81. It's huge. Japan was zero, but the US is average -5, -10, and after COVID, they did -15. Too big. That's why they got huge inflation and hiking interest rate. So we have to control this net domestic fund demand in terms of the power of the money creation. So that is my idea. So that Japan net domestic fund demand was over zero. That's why Japan's nominal GDP growth was zero. Interest rate was zero. We need -5. That's enough. But we do not like -15. We'll get huge inflation. So that is my idea, net domestic fund demand. And actually, I have published English book, Sanae no Mix, and the blueprint for Japan's economic dominance. So this is Japanese book. We translated this book to English. So if you have time, please read it. And if you give me some comments, that is very helpful.
I will do that. I look forward to it. I'm pleased my book is being translated into Japanese as well. There's such a minority of people who think about the economy with a realistic understanding of the accounting behind it. And you are one of those people. And I am as well, obviously. So we need to communicate these ideas more effectively because we are fighting so many myths that dominate both people's perspective about what the government does and perspective about the role of the financial system. They are both completely wrong. I think in many ways I see our situation as being like Galileo at the time of the Inquisition, where he was crucified effectively for telling people that the universe was centered not on the earth, but on the sun. And we are trying to convince people that no, it is not the planets don't orbit the earth. The earth orbits the sun. And it's the mental flip is too big for most people to cope with. But we now have the tools that can explain this, my Ravel software being one of those tools and get people to effectively look through what I call a monetary telescope to see the actual structure, not the myths they're taught by economics textbooks.
Okay, thank you very much for a great discussion. And please keep in touch to change the world.
Will do. I look forward to doing it with you. Thank you.